Hello again, folks. It's been a while. I've been very hard at work on Island and on screaming at my son's football games where I caught a cold and lost most of my voice. So I apologize, but the show must go on, and it will. As a podcaster, I felt the need to listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot. And when I look at either Spotify's or Apple's top 10 list at any given time, I'd be lucky to find one or two that I can listen to with any regularity. It's no knock on any of them. They're all well produced for the most part. And I commend anyone who does this on any level, really. Churning out content with any sort of regularity is real work. And if that content happens to maintain any formative flow of theme, then that's an even greater accomplishment. That being said, to each his own. And if you listen to this podcast, you know that I believe that the characters define the history and that purposeful storytelling starts with the characters. God is in the details. Well, as I said a few months back, I am recommending 3 podcasts this year, 3 which don't really have anything to do with each other than they tell great stories, do it with integrity, and they really stick to the facts, beholding truth as the ultimate source. Well, today's guest not only appreciates and understands storytelling, but he also reveres character and how it drives a story. And he likes to really get to know those characters, from the dust on their coat to the sweat on their back to the passion in their soul, the way I do. And that's only one of the reasons I have great respect for him. Because for this, the second of these 3 recommendations, I am going to introduce you to a young man who doesn't just devour books the way I devour chocolate and caffeine, but he does it like he's on a mission, which may have something to do with his background and education. After all, he was trained in going on missions, and he went to a decent school that happens to know a bit about it. The podcast is History Nerds United, but he's not your average nerd. Because after graduating from the United States Military Academy at West Point, he deployed to Iraq in 2005 as a tank platoon leader with the 3rd Brigade, 3rd ID, 1st of the 15th Infantry. And I gotta believe that his acute focus on the details has as much to do with that training and experience as with his relentless lust for all things historical. So now, being that my intros are always exponentially longer than his, I'm going to take a cue from his playbook and say, why don't I shut up now so you can meet this fascinating young man whom I am proud to introduce to you as my friend and colleague, Brendan Dowd. Welcome, Mynheer.
Chance, thank you so much for bringing me on here, brother. I hope I can live up to that intro.
Oh, I'm sure you will. It's great to see you again. Tell me, how's the podcast going?
It's going really well. We're pretty busy. Did an interview last night and have about 30 more lined up with 10 more in the can. So plenty more coming.
Awesome. You and I met through this realm specifically, which is really cool. I think it's one of the really nice unintended byproducts of being in this business, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, especially with what you just said in the intro, history podcasts can go a lot of different ways, a lot of different flavors. And, I remember listening to yours and I'm like, oh, this is one I can just put on and just let it roll.
Ditto, my friend, because you never cease to amaze me in making topics that, admittedly, I may read the headline and say, I just don't know if that's going to be interesting, and you make it interesting because of that acute interest in the details that you take. And you and I, we're in this sort of off the beaten path sector here of podcasts, I mean, and I don't say that with any form of disparagement. I mean it almost as a badge of honor. We'll say as a temporary badge of honor, but you're not beholden to anybody or anything other than your own conscience, God, and your listeners. Am I correct?
Absolutely. I mean, when I did this, it's a side gig for me. It's a passion project. I have a day job as government consultant, and it started as a blog and became the podcast when my best friend of 25 years, Mike, came on. And our big thing was, this is ours. We don't answer to anybody. So we love everybody. You write a good book, probably be on the podcast.
Now listen to me. you have an uncanny knack for devouring books and retaining minute details of those books. And I mean, in this day and age, particularly, that really seems all the more remarkable.
I'm sort of, I don't. I read a lot of really good books. Talking with other people who do book reviews, they'll say, you give a lot of 5-star reviews, which I will give myself credit. I'm good at picking out what I like, and I just end up with these really, really good books. And I mean, this is definitely a racket, right? Like you've got to sit down, you've got to do all this research. I just read a really good book, and then all I have to do is come up with some questions and let these authors just sell the book themselves, and they're great at it.
No, you're consistently humble, but I'm still amazed at the amount of books you read. How many books do you read? Like, let's say in a month
Well, it's probably easier on Sunday. Last Sunday, I finished my 100th book of the year.
of the year.
Of the year.
All right, let's break that down. Weeks, month. So we're in that's
So
10,
I
10
think
months.
the last time I did the math, I finish a book every 3 to 4 days.
And now we're not talking little pamphlets.
No.
What's the last book you read? What is it?
The last book I read was on the murder of Polly Klaas back in the day. Huge murder. Author named Kim Cross just came out with a book, and I mean that one was on the shorter end. I think it's only like 350 pages, but just plowed through it.
Man, you blow me away, not just with the quantity, the volume, but the details that you retain. For example, your one of your recent ones with author Daryl Hartman, The Battle of Ink and Ice. You after you talk all about Cook and Peary, the two explorers who are profiled in that story, you ask him about a character named Arthur Brisbane, and even by his admission, he says Brisbane's a pretty minor character in this overall story. But
I mean, because these are big books, as we talked about, right? 350, 400 pages. And you could just summarize a book, but that may not sell it. But it's these little things that kind of really pull out a story. And for me, I want the podcast to be for people who wouldn't necessarily pick up a history book. It's the last question I ask basically every author, which is, if somebody who said history is boring, it's a class you took in high school and you don't need to do it anymore, I know these people are missing out because they read boring history books, or they just haven't had it presented to them in a way that gets them excited about it. So my entire thing is finding those little pieces that make somebody say, like you were talking about Battle of Ink and Ice, it's a great book, but for people who may not pick it up, hey, by the way, there's this guy in there who's basically the grandfather of those sizzle headlines, the stuff on the New York Post that people love or hate to love, whatever you want. There's a guy who this was his thing, and the impetus for the way that comes out. And that's something that can make somebody take a chance on a book that they may not necessarily think about doing just based upon reading the cover.
it's really what makes it interesting. It's really what makes history cool, isn't it? When you really get inside that mindset and those characters.
I mean, what I always say to people too is when they say history is boring or things like that, I point out something like, hey, do you like Game of Thrones? And inevitably, a lot of people said, maybe not season 8, but they loved a lot of Game of Thrones. And I just remind them, hey, Red Wedding, really insane episode, right? Like, how do people come up with that? And they'll say, yeah, I'm like, that's based upon an actual historical wedding in Scotland in, like, I forget, like the 1300s or something. A lot of the coolest things you'll see, you go back to these authors, they're pulling from history.
I also love the way history and origins, elements of history weave their way through time and through various sectors of history. That story, like we were talking with Daryl Hartman about, it's the Battle of Ink and Ice. Is it talks about this race to find the North Pole, but as it's chronicled by the various newspapers. And that story itself, I'm listening to your podcast, I'm going, of that episode, I'm going, oh my God, that's part of my story, because the history of media is in New York. That's all. That's a component of the history of New York. And I know that story pretty well, and I've been getting to know it better. And I know about James Gordon Bennett Jr. and Sr. Check this out. You've heard me talk about my Uncle John, my great Uncle John Kelly.
Absolutely.
he was a newsboy for James Gordon Bennett Sr. when he was like 12.
Seriously.
Yeah. Isn't that awesome? I mean, just the way it intertwines with other stories is, I love when that happens. And that happens all the time when I listen to your podcast.
What's important for me is also, if you listen to the podcast, I love the book. If somebody sends me a book and I read it and it's just not for me, then I'm not going to do a podcast on it. So if I'm getting on there, I either absolutely loved it or there was something in it that is just so cool that, the world needs to kind of know about it. The world that's listening to me anyway. So hopefully that'll get bigger as we go along.
Yeah. I mean, that comes across. And you, I told you this also. The first one I listened to of yours was the one with author Alexander Rose, who did Turn. Dude, I'm like, my wife and I are like Turn junkies. I could watch Turn on an infinite loop and just be more excited about it every time. I love the way that show came out. And that's the kind of historical drama I like. And it was a great interview you did with him.
I mean, the coolest thing about that, I was just floored because he reached out to me. I just read the book. I put up, the review on Goodreads and things like that, and didn't think about it. And all of a sudden, I get an email, and it just continues to humble me that I'll have authors either that respond to an email or reach out themselves.
What do kids need in order to find history cool?
It needs to be presented to them in a cool way. My mother, she was a history teacher, and she was fantastic at it. She would know when she was teaching, when she saw kids' eyes start to glaze over, to just throw something out there. Because she was really kind of my example. I woke up every morning to my mother reading the book. And then we go into history class and things like that. And she just knew she was a lot of people's favorite teacher. And you have to present it in a way. A lot of these authors, I'll ask them, right, that question: how do you get people to read history? And a lot of it comes back to present it in an interesting way, and also kind of knowing what you like too. For me, the Roman Empire is hard to read about because you have to have a good amount of background before you kind of jump in, so you can understand what the words are and things like that. I don't know what a senator is half the time. Wait, what does that mean? How many years and things like that. So I got to be careful when I go in there. But like the American Revolution, just give it to me. If you wrote it, just give it to me. I'm going to have a good time. So it's about kind of knowing what you're into, but also making sure that's going to get presented. I mean, these books, I say 95% are really good books, or at least readable and things like that. And finding those as opposed to picking up a textbook can make you hate anything. If it's not, it's a textbook. Come on now.
When did history become cool for you?
I tell you, it was always cool for me. If there was a movie coming out, but it was after I got out of the Army and, got a civilian job, I all of a sudden had a lot of time on the train outside of DC, going into DC and coming back, and not reliable internet. And I said, oh, you know what? It's time to pick up books again. And once I did that, I was off to the races. Picked up some really good books that just reminded me, like, I love this. And I was a binge reader for a while, where 4 or 5 months I put the gaming controller down, I turned the TV off, and I read some books. But once I got back to that, I just got back into it. Now, I mean, on an off year, it's probably about 70 to 80 books a year. But now that I'm making it a thing, it's usually about 100 to 120.
Almost sounds like it's your job.
It's a second job, basically.
Veldig, young man, tell everybody again the name of the podcast and how they can find you.
History Nerds United. We're on every major app on there. Just type in our name, History Nerds United. There's also the blog, historynerdsunited.com. And we're going to be launching a YouTube channel soon as well, because Chance told me I had to, and that it needs to be done. So we're doing it, sir. I'm listening.
Wow. My influence counts, apparently. Well, Brendan Dowd, I happily report that you and I are officially co-conspirators in this hallowed pursuit of making history cool. And I am quite honored to be a part of your club, sir, now and forever. Bedankt, meneer.
Thanks, Chance. This was amazing.
Great seeing you. All right, we'll talk soon.
Bye.
The podcast is History Nerds United, and you can get it wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks a lot, Brendan. Great work as always. Keep it up.